Okay, it is my privilege to serve as moderator for our last panel of the day. I'm Dr. Suzanne Levere, and we have this wonderful panel entitled World History to end our day. We've got something for everyone on this panel. We've got ancient Rome, medieval Vikings, French Revolution, 19th and 20th century Latin American leaders. We've got it all here. And we're actually going to proceed in chronological order with these papers as well. So we're going to start off our panel with a paper entitled The Battle That Broke Rome by Randy Swim.
All right, so many of you here are more than likely familiar with HBO's Game of Thrones series. Based off the works of George R.R. Martin, the series is filled with dramatic battle sequences that spell out the fate of both the nobles and the kingdoms involved. Battles like this, though, are not just found on Hollywood screens or within the pages of fantasy novels. Epic battles that lead to the downfall of entire empires can be found written along the pages of history. One such battle, the historic Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE, meant exactly that for the Roman Empire. This battle between invading Gothic forces and the Roman army was not only a major event in the decline of the Roman Empire, but it truly signaled the collapse of the empire decades before the last Western emperor was overthrown. We can see how this battle led to this through the decline in imperial authority after the death of Emperor Valens, the furthered split between the eastern and western parts of the empire, and the increased barbarian activity inside the bounds of the empire that eventually led to the sack of Rome and the creation of independent barbarian kingdoms. However, to truly understand the battle and its importance, we have to trace its roots all the way back past the 3rd century crisis to the time of the Severn emperors. The Severn Dynasty, which ruled during the mid to late 2nd century CE, relied heavily on the Roman army to keep themselves in power. In exchange for the army's support, the emperors were expected to raise the pay and the prestige of the military. While this worked great for the first Severan ruler, subsequent emperors had to keep increasing the army's pay, nearly bankrupting Rome in the process. On top of the economic issues, this quickly turned the Roman military into the strongest political force in the empire. If the emperor didn't meet their demands, they would simply depose him and raise one of their generals to the position of emperor. This led directly to the 3rd century crisis, a period of time where more than 20 rulers were elevated to the status of emperor, and almost all died through assassination or on the field of battle. Indirectly, it led to overconfidence in the Roman army, as well as political dependence on their support. On top of that, both emperors at the time of Adrianople, Valentinian I in the west, and Valens in the east, were put into power by their legions. Secondly, it is important to understand that the different barbarian groups had been trying to enter the empire for hundreds of years. Some groups had come to terms with the Romans and were actively settling at the borders of the Roman Empire. Others, like many of the German tribes that lived past the Danube and Rhine rivers, took every opportunity they could to cross into the empire to conduct raids. However, a new threat was leading many Germanic tribes, like the Goths, to seek formal asylum in the empire: the Huns. It was around this time that the Huns, led by the legendary Attila, were pushing westward. Frightened by their approach, many groups of barbarians attempted to flee rather than to fight. A group of Goths, in a desperate bid for safety, petitioned Emperor Valens for asylum. Seeing this as an opportunity to protect his own borders, Valens agreed to let 100,000 Goths settle just inside the border of the empire. In exchange for them acting as border guards, Valens also promised that they would receive food and other commodities. However, through the actions of corrupt Roman officials, the Goths did not receive the food and commodities that they had been promised. Angered by the promises that were not being kept, the Goths rose up under a leader named Fritigern and started to move south. This is what led to the Battle of Adrianople. On the one hand, we have Roman soldiers overconfident in their superiority. On the other hand, we have Gothic forces fighting, literally, for their survival. For Valens leading up to the battle, victory was already assured. All he cared about was the personal glory that he would achieve by defeating the Goths, and never once did the thought of defeat cross his mind. The dawn of Adrianople saw a lot of disagreement among the Roman officers. The scouts' reports had come in and estimated the number of Goths to be very low. On top of that, the Ostrogothic cavalry was nowhere to be found, far away from the rest of the army. Some of the Roman generals argued that they should strike immediately, advocating a swift defeat and full personal glory for Valens. Others argued that they should wait so that they could be reinforced by Valens' nephew Gratian, whose forces were only a day's march away. Valens made the fatal decision to move forward with the battle and not wait for reinforcements. When the Romans reached the field of battle, it was clear that they had underestimated the number of Goths that would be present. Valens, however, was not perturbed by this. In the eyes of the emperor, his superior soldiers would prevail, no matter the numbers. Under the pretense of trying to end the conflict with peace, the Goths sent ambassadors to meet with the emperor. However, it was simply a ploy to stall for time. Their ploy worked, and by the start of the battle, the Ostrogothic cavalry returned, to the downfall of the Roman forces. To make a long story short, the Roman army was completely routed, their forces were shattered, and Emperor Valens was killed. Those Roman soldiers that survived fled indiscriminately from the battlefield, and the Goths continued to push south, deeper into the heart of the Roman Empire. The power of the emperor never recovered after the death of Valens. While he, like many emperors before him, had split the rule of the empire with a co-emperor, he was still fairly powerful. Theodosius, who took power in the year following Valens' death, was the last emperor to rule both halves of the empire. After his death, the split between East and West became permanent. And as the emperor in the East became more powerful, the emperor in the West declined to the status of a figurehead. True power in the West resided in the hands of Roman generals like that of General Stilicho. This split between the East and West can also be attributed in part to the loss at Adrianople. As Theodosius and later emperors diverted more and more resources east to deal with the invading Goths, other tribes began to move into parts of the Western Empire. Because of this, by 432, the Roman army had completely pulled out of Britain, Spain, and North Africa. As the Gothic threat shifted westward, the East began to be more stabilized and further increased the separation between the two parts of the empire, which would never again be reunited. To answer the threat from the Goths after Adrianople, Theodosius granted small parcels of land to different tribes of Goths in an attempt to placate them. However, this did very little to end the threat, and the Goths continued to push westward. The Gothic forces who had been united under Fritigern during Adrianople were once again united under a new leader by the name of Alaric. Alaric led the Gothic campaign against the Romans as they steadily moved westward towards Rome, with the aforementioned Stilicho in charge of the defending Roman forces. Late in the year 410, Alaric's forces prevailed over Stilicho's and set up a siege around the city of Rome. While some accounts exist, it is not known for certain how Alaric's forces broke into the city. Regardless, it is certain that the Goths would never have been able to sack Rome in 410 if their forces had been shattered at Adrianople 30 years previously. In response to the sack of Rome, a Western Roman patrician by the name of Constantius granted the Visigoths a small portion of territory in southern Gaul. The Goths did not, however, stay solely in the territory given to them. Over the next few years, after the establishment of their own government separate from that of the Romans, they began to expand their territory. They conquered more of Gaul and pushed south to take Spain from the Vandals that held it at the time. Other groups of barbarians, like the Franks and the Vandals themselves, were also carving out parts of Roman territory. The Vandals, after being pushed from Spain, established their own kingdom in North Africa. Shortly after the Visigothic settlement, other barbarian groups established a kingdom in Italy, essentially turning the last Western emperors into figureheads. This lasted until 476, when the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was overthrown, marking the true end of the Roman Empire. Looking back at all the effects presented here, there are a few important things that need to be taken into account. First, it must be acknowledged that it is hard to determine how many of these events can directly be related back to the Battle of Adrianople. Can an argument be made that the Visigoths ended up in Spain because of their victory at Adrianople? Did the loss at Adrianople directly lead to the further split between the Eastern and Western empires? Yes and no. The reality of the situation is that many different complex factors went into determining the outcomes of these events. It would be short-sighted and frankly wrong to claim that Adrianople was the single most important factor of all the events listed here. It would also, though, be just as wrong to claim that it had no impact. Imagine for a minute that the Romans had defeated the Goths at Adrianople. With their main fighting force destroyed, the surviving Goths scatter. Over the course of the next few months, they are hunted down and either killed or incorporated into the empire. Then, instead of devoting years' worth of effort into a war, the empire is able to more securely shore up its borders from other barbarian groups. We may never have seen the carving away of the empire by barbarians. We certainly would not have seen the same organized force of Goths managing to sack Rome. While Roman victory at Adrianople might not have prevented the collapse of the empire entirely, it would certainly have made it so that Romans could have allocated their resources to slowing down or stopping entirely other problems that they were facing. However, the same argument could also be made that the Roman overconfidence would have eventually led to a similar outcome in a battle with a different barbarian group. Secondly, it is important to note that many of the issues present after the battle were not as prominent beforehand. While it's true that issues like ineffective emperors have been plaguing the empire for centuries, we see an almost complete decline in power after the battle. This is in stark contrast to the empire's previous trend of cycling between decades of ineffective leadership, followed by a few years of very strong emperors. Indeed, it is the common belief that by the end of the 4th century, Rome was already on the verge of collapse. However, in reality, the empire was in a relatively strong position leading up to Adrianople. It is also important to note that at the time, Rome was fairly stable politically and had been since the reign of Constantine at the start of the 4th century. An even more important factor, as historian Alessandro Barbaro writes, the Roman Empire in the 4th century, therefore, was not an empire in decline, and a proof of this assertion is the fact that the barbarians wanted to join it, unquote. While this seems on the surface to be very self-explanatory, this is actually an incredibly important assertion. Barbarians are not usually considered to be intelligent, mostly because of the stigma of how the word was used by both the Greeks and the Romans. However, credit must be given to them. Why would they want to join an empire if it was already on the verge of collapse before Adrianople? Overall, though, it is important to understand that the Battle of Adrianople marks the major start of Roman decline, not the true end. Adrianople is, though, a perfect case study in how military losses can contribute to the decline of a government. While they might not be the sole contributor to the decline, they work to compound other issues that the government might be experiencing. In relation to the history of Rome, fully understanding the events of Adrianople can help to conceptualize how such a powerful empire was able to collapse so suddenly in relative terms. Adrianople can also show us, through the actions of Valens, how cultural perceptions of other people can also affect the decline of an empire. As many have said before, overconfidence truly is a slow and insidious killer. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Randy. Our next paper is presented by Carmen Bowser, and it's entitled Vikings. It's all just a big misunderstanding.
Throughout history, groups of people have been misrepresented. The Vikings are one such group, depicted in popular culture as savage barbarians, iconic for their ruthless raids. While accurate, other aspects of Viking life are less represented in popular culture. The unique organization of Viking society, women's role in society, the impact of religion and Christianization on society, and literature and art produced by this diverse group provide evidence that Scandinavians were not simply brutal warriors, but a dynamic society. This evidence will set Scandinavians apart from Vikings, which was not a persona, but an activity in which a small percentage of Scandinavian society participated. Vikings, portrayed in film, literature, and even in marketing advertisements, depict savage and merciless warriors who murdered indiscriminately. There is no argument that portions of Scandinavian populations traveled great distances in order to claim settlements of land for themselves, and in the process executed brutal raids. Of these raids, one of the most well-known is that on the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793 CE, which many historians use as a mark of the beginning of the Viking Age. According to the English monk Alcuin of York, in a letter to King Ethelred in 793 CE, "Behold the church of St. Cuthbert, spattered with the blood of priests of God, despoiled of its ornaments. A place more venerable than all in Britain is given as prey to pagan peoples." This excerpt is only one example of historical records indicating the brutality of Vikings during the height of their raiding expeditions. Popular culture's stereotypical view of Vikings typically involves a barbaric marauder of villages. However, Vikings were much more than this Hollywood depiction. Scandinavians were, according to Kristen Wolfe, primarily farmers, fishermen, merchants, shipbuilders, craftsmen, blacksmiths, and carpenters. Scandinavian society was a kinship-based society that conformed to the Indo-European pattern of a class society. Beyond the agricultural or craftsmanship-based professions, trade with distant societies was the most significant part of the economy. Uniquely Scandinavian longships, shallow boats that were not only strong enough to withstand long sea voyages, but shallow enough to navigate narrow fjords, allowed for extensive international travel. Trade exploded and allowed for increased expansion, settlement, and exposure to and integration of new cultures and religions. Scandinavia was often seen as the primitive outlier to the north, yet historical research has shown that this society and culture was very aligned with other Indo-European societies. Scandinavia's society rested upon a societal structure in which there were free men, slaves, and aristocracy. Free men were responsible for local legislation and settling disputes within their communities. According to Kristen Wolfe, while the king was considered the top in the social hierarchy, he had no absolute authority as lawmaker or judge. Scandinavian government consisted largely on what is known as the Thing, or assemblies held at regular intervals to decide on such matters such as pasture rights, use of forests, construction of bridges, and to settle disputes between neighbors or families. Much like a modern-day court of law, Things featured a jury of one's peers and investigated civil disputes. Scandinavian societal structure and system of governance reflects many of other European societies during this period. This, however, is overlooked in favor of a focus on their paganistic religion. This focus, primarily by the Christian clergy, reinforces the stereotype of Scandinavians' primitive heathenism. Religion, both polytheistic paganism and monotheistic Christianity, played critical roles in shaping the Viking Age society and culture. Prior to Christianization, Scandinavians' polytheistic pagan belief system was considered major evidence to their barbaric and uncivilized way of life in the eyes of the Indo-European Christian clergy. Despite having few written religious records, the Scandinavians' oral tradition remains surprisingly intact and overall consistent. Scandinavian religious worship centered around sacrifice and maintaining a good relationship with their gods. Among these gods, Odin was deemed one of the most important, the All-Father, the god of kings. Prior to Christianization, it was not surprising to see women act as cult leaders and given significant religious responsibilities. With the conversion to Christianity, this practice was prohibited, altering the role of women in Scandinavian society. According to Wolfe, Scandinavians had known of Christianity for several hundred years before conversion took place. Christianization also offered sufficient replacement of symbols, with saints and angels filling the role of mythical and supernatural idols, adapting itself to the already established cultural role that religion played. However, despite this progressive adaptability, some aspects of Christianization were not so seamless. As seen historically in many European civilizations, church and state often go hand in hand in altering each other in the process. For Scandinavia, a patchwork land of chieftains and kings, the desire for a unifying aristocratic power grew, and the appeal of Christianity in supporting such a unified kingdom came with a price. According to Peter Sawyer's research, the consequences of sin began to regulate life. Most church law was based on a man's relationship with the invisible God, and what in pagan society had been a right and a duty, such as revenge, was now made an offense against God and the king. Resistance to such change in cultural norms naturally followed, and as a king's power grew in alignment with Christianity, compulsory conversion began to take violent turns. King Olaf Tryggvason was particularly brutal in his means of persuading his subjects to embrace Christianity. In an excerpt from Heimskringla, Snorri Sturluson records, King Olaf decreed that all men who were sorcerers and were known to be guilty of practicing witchcraft and magic be summoned to him. He had all these men put in one room and given strong drink. When they were drunk, Olaf had the building set alight, and the room was destroyed by the fire along with everyone inside. Olaf, like other kings throughout Europe, recognized the unifying force the church represented, and aligning themselves with it was critical to increasing and maintaining their power. The alignment of royalty with the church to maintain unity and increase the power of nobility provides yet another example of how similar Scandinavian society was to other European societies. Scandinavia was a patriarchal society that did designate women predominantly in the domestic sphere. However, despite this patriarchy, the role of women in the Viking Age allowed for a considerable amount of freedom in comparison to similar societal structures. Women were permitted to inherit land if widowed and seek divorce, such as in cases of infidelity or abuse. Additionally, Scandinavian myths and sagas are rich with the tales of female warriors. Although until recently, this idea has been strictly held as legend. In such myths, Odin's female assistants, known as Valkyries, were the terrifying furies of the Viking world. The most compelling evidence of such women is the discovery and genomic testing of remains presumed to be of a male warrior. According to the Hedenstierna Johnson's research team, the grave contained a sword, an axe, a spear, armor-piercing arrows, a battle knife, 2 shields, and 2 horses, thus the complete equipment of a professional warrior. Furthermore, to suggest that this particular warrior was adept at strategy and part of tactical training, the grave also contained a full set of gaming pieces, indicating the buried individual's role as a high-ranking officer. Genomic testing was performed and definitively determined that the high-status grave was the burial of a high-ranking female Viking warrior. While some historians have argued that perhaps there was a second individual that may have occupied the grave and that these artifacts didn't actually belong to the female warrior, the research team determined that the distribution of the grave goods and their spatial relation to the female individual disputes that possibility. Oftentimes, the level of sophistication of medieval civilizations is viewed through a lens of their literary and artistic contribution and the adherence to certain aesthetic norms. The misconception that Scandinavians had limited literacy capabilities prior to Christianization persisted, despite the Scandinavians establishing an alphabetic system known as the rune system. While it is not recorded if literacy was prevalent among the Scandinavian people or reserved for the elite, the fact that such rune stones were as a rule erected in public places suggests that they were intended to be seen or read. Despite the suggestion of mass literacy, the Scandinavian society was still overwhelmingly an oral society, indicated by the few sources of historical records. The deviation of the runic alphabet and movement to the Roman alphabet also meant a deviation from an oral tradition to that of written record of myths and legends. According to Wolff, verse appears to have been the preferred means of literary expression, as seen in the extensive sagas written depicting the lives of the kings. These sagas, despite heavily incorporating myths and folk tales, were taken as historical fact for centuries. Scandinavian culture also produced very distinctive artistic contributions, underscored by their functionality. Bruce Gelsinger notes that we see Scandinavian art in the form of applied art, the decoration of functional objects in everyday life, as that of the metalwork seen in personal adornments, as well as the intricacy of detailed carvings in weapons and shields. Sturdier materials, such as the Gotland stones, depict examples of the distinct and recurring themes seen in Scandinavian art, particularly naturalistic themes. These Gotland stones, erected in around 500 CE, are strong examples of the emphasis of animal motifs found throughout most of Scandinavian art, a motif that evolved over the course of the Viking Age. The gripping beast motif is seen quite often in the infamous longships used by Viking sailors, a uniquely Scandinavian artistic feature. During the mid-12th century, this distinct style of art began to decline and is paralleled with the mass conversion of Christianity for the Scandinavian people, and in its place, a more Roman-influenced stylistic trend arrived. Overlooking Scandinavia's strong oral histories and functionality of their artistry prior to Christianization reinforced the stereotype of a primitive and uncivilized society incapable of producing such sophisticated works of art. The scarcity of written records prior to Christianization leads to a one-sided representation from the victims, with priests and clergymen of the ransacked monasteries who were well acquainted with the written word describing the violent behavior of Vikings. The raids on monasteries were shocking for a Christian Europe, not in that they were more brutal than the raids on villages or ports, but that they had been raided at all. The willingness to attack sacred monasteries and clergy only gave credence to the portrayal of Vikings as uncivilized pagan heathens. These depictions fail to note that raiding was common among many societies within mainland Europe, not solely a Viking trait, or that these wealthy monasteries were often left undefended. Due to the way they were depicted in contemporary documents by those they raided and in modern popular culture, it is difficult to conjure up the image of a Viking without depicting an unclean, bloodthirsty, brutish man wearing a horned helmet. Recovered evidence, however, provides a better look at a larger picture of a Scandinavian society in which progressive social constructs, religious adaptability, and complex artistic and literary achievements existed. As René Chartrand succinctly states, it is a matter of emphasis, less emphasis on the raiding, more on the trading, less on the pillage, more on the poetry and the artistry, less on the terror, more on the technology of these dynamic people, and the positive impact that they had on the countries they affected. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Carmen. Our next paper, we're going to fast forward several centuries. Hannah Smith is going to be presenting on the cult of the supreme being, de-Christianization in the French Revolutionary Agenda.
Okay.
Throughout the first years of the French Revolution, culture in France changed. Revolutionary leaders sought to override anything that had to do with the old regime and replace them with anything that had to do with the new narrative of the revolution. Revolutionary leaders began creating festivals to make the revolution a part of citizens' everyday lives, and to celebrate and teach people about the revolution. The most significant themes of the revolution seen in these festivals were reason and liberty. Celebrations of Catholicism turned to celebrations of reason, liberty, and revolutionary heroes and events. One of these more famous festivals of the French Revolution, the Festival of Reason, sought to replace Christianity with a civil religion based on reason. This was part of a larger effort to de-Christianize French culture and society. Eventually, the cult of reason would be replaced with the cult of the Supreme Being, masterminded by Maximilien Robespierre, who believed reason alone was not enough and that the people needed to believe in a higher power as well. Rooted in Enlightenment ideas, Robespierre's cult of the Supreme Being sought to replace Christianity with a civil religion, showing Robespierre's attempt to create and then control his idea of an enlightened society. The cult of the Supreme Being, which overtook the cult of reason, was rooted in the Enlightenment ideas of the philosophers, especially those of Voltaire and Rousseau. Like nearly every aspect of the French Revolution, the inspiration for the cult of reason and the Supreme Being can be traced back to Enlightenment ideas. Historian Charles A. Gliozo claimed that the de-Christianization movement during the Revolution was nurtured from the deistic and atheistic writings of the philosophers. Many of the philosophers tasked themselves with rejecting the traditional authority of the Catholic Church in favor for reason and progress. Voltaire and Rousseau's ideas, in particular, related the most to the de-Christianization movement during the French Revolution and culminated to form the cult of reason. Now, the cult of the Supreme Being replaced the cult of reason because revolutionary leaders needed to keep the festivals of the French Revolution up to date. According to Mona Azouf, as new generations of the revolution ensued, revolutionary leaders needed to establish the originality of the festivals and link each festival with new purposes. Revolutionary leaders believed the cult and festival of the Supreme Being better suited their goal of liberty, which the cult and festival of reason endangered because of their possibility to destroy liberty by atheism. As the revolution progressed, leaders realized the cult of reason was too atheistic. They needed to promote de-Christianization, not atheism altogether. If atheism destroyed liberty, it was counterproductive to revolutionary thought. This is where the ideas of Voltaire and Rousseau were crucial in the creation of the cult of the Supreme Being. Voltaire's ideas on deism were influential in creating the cult of the Supreme Being and the progress of the de-Christianization movement of the Revolution. While Voltaire was adamantly against the Catholic Church and Christianity, his ideas of religion reflected deism rather than atheism. In his famous novel Candide, main character Candide traveled to the utopia of El Dorado, where the people worshipped a single god who had already given them everything they needed, so they therefore had use for neither clergy members nor praying. This reflected Voltaire's advocacy for deism, in which God was a watchmaker, rather than a being who involved himself in the affairs of humans. Voltaire expressed a belief in a supreme being, but one to which the people need not pray. Further, that this utopian religion had no official members of a church reflected Voltaire's condemnation of a Christian hierarchy, which, according to Gliozo, has significant influence on the formation of the National Convention's civil constitution of the clergy. The civil constitution of the clergy stated bishops and parish priests were to be chosen by one mode, that of election. This was the beginning of the de-Christianization movement during the French Revolution, which was indirectly affected by Voltaire's philosophies. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, on the other hand, directly influenced the cult of the Supreme Being, as his ideas were central to Maximilien Robespierre's view of human will. First, Rousseau's The Social Contract influenced Robespierre's view of a civil religion, the dogma of which excludes intolerance and includes the happiness of the just and the sanctity of the social contract and the laws. Robespierre believed his cult of the Supreme Being would be the civil religion. Second, as Azouf claimed, the Festival of the Supreme Being represented a fantasy return to the equality of origins. This notion is also found in The Social Contract, where Rousseau promoted the idea of man going back to nature. Robespierre wanted the cult of the Supreme Being to represent this idea. Rousseau had a particularly strong influence on Robespierre, and his philosophy of religion influenced Robespierre's decision to replace the cult of reason with the cult of the Supreme Being. The cult of the Supreme Being sought to replace Christianity in the everyday lives of citizens and solidify ideals of the Revolution as a new avenue of moral authority, of morality in society. This is most notably seen in the language and symbols used in the Festival of the Supreme Being. Historian Lynn Hunt claimed that when a revolution challenges the legitimacy of traditional government, it must challenge the traditional trappings of rule as well. Probably the most outstanding legitimization used by the monarchy was that of the divine right of the king. Traditional wisdom, or the Catholic Church, said the king was God's representative on earth. According to Hunt, in order for citizens to regain their own political responsibilities, the French had to eliminate all these symbolic connections to monarchy and the king's body. If revolutionary leaders needed to challenge the legitimacy of the king, it needed to challenge the traditional authority of the church and its symbolic relations. Robespierre's solution was to create the cult and festival of the Supreme Being. The language used by the National Convention upon establishing the Festival of the Supreme Being, and by Robespierre in announcing the festival, indicated Robespierre's intention to make the cult the new moral authority. According to Hunt, revolutionary leaders spoke in two registers at once, one political and one sacred, and language simultaneously took on enormous significance and became the source of significance. In the National Convention's decree, inspired by Robespierre, the convention declared the worship of the Supreme Being as the practice of the duties of man. Further, at the Festival of the Supreme Being in Tuileries, Robespierre proclaimed the great being had created man to attain to happiness by way of virtue. In this way, both political revolutionary language, duties of man and virtue, and sacred language, worship and the great being, were used to establish the existence of the new moral authority. More than symbolic language, the Festival of the Supreme Being also secularized Christian symbols. The repurposing or replacement of Christian symbols during the Festival of the Supreme Being symbolically consecrated the new civil religion. The Declaration of Rights of Man as Citizen replaced the Bible. A flood of patriotic anthems replaced hymns and prayers. A fast for the sake of liberty replaced Lent, and civic priests were chosen not from among the celibates, but from among family men. In this way, revolutionary and secular symbols replaced Christian ones, not only in the celebration of the cult, but in the everyday lives of citizens. While the repurposing of traditionally Christian symbols was significant in de-Christianization and the creation of the cult, Robespierre also used new symbols for the festival that sanctified the cult of the Supreme Being. Two particularly remarkable symbols of secularity, David's statue of Hercules and his mountain, became part of the Festival of the Supreme Being. According to Hunt, as revolutionary festivals became more elaborate, more symbols were incorporated into them. Robespierre called on contemporary artist Jacques-Louis David to erect a statue of Hercules that portrayed not brutality and violence, as the traditional Greco-Roman symbol suggested, but grace and composure. Moreover, the statue made his own offering to the Supreme Being. In this way, David showed even a god of the past worshiping the new symbol of the French civil religion. Further, David and Robespierre positioned the statue next to a large artificial mountain created by David. The mound was symbolic of the mountain faction of the National Convention, who were the furthest left, most revolutionary faction of the original National Convention. With the erection of these two symbols, Robespierre sought to revolve the civil religion around the radical ideas of the revolution. De-Christianization in itself was not enough to explain the significance of the Festival of the Supreme Being. Both it and de-Christianization were part of a larger plot to glorify the revolution. Ozouf argued that while festivals may have sprang from the wish to replace Catholic worship with a new cult, it may also have had a political motivation. Not only did Robespierre want to give the people something other than a Christian god to worship, he wanted to do so as part of a larger political plot. In the context of a political motivation, the Festival of the Supreme Being played into Robespierre's revolutionary agenda. However, the festival was not for the sake of the citizens, but for the sake of Robespierre's control over the revolution. Robespierre sought to control the revolutionary narrative through the Festival of the Supreme Being. According to Hunt, by incorporating revolutionary and repurposed Christian symbols, the festival marked the disciplining of new forms of popular power. Robespierre used the revolutionary symbols in an attempt to force the new moral authority on citizens. As Ozouf argued, the sheer number of revolutionary symbols was indicative of a deliberately engineered festival where their meanings to the organizers always triumphed over the meaning experienced by the participants. When Robespierre called on Republican Frenchmen to purify the earth which kings have soiled, he indeed tried to appeal to the French people, but only to turn them into the kind of revolutionary subjects he desired. The Festival of the Supreme Being was not for the people, it was for himself. Robespierre, caught up in his own idea of a revolutionary populace, made the cult of the Supreme Being all about himself. This became clear to witnesses of the festival. Writer Joachim Vallat said Robespierre walked at the head of the convention and appeared as both master and God. Writer Marc-Antoine Baudot said it appeared Robespierre wanted to convince others of his dictatorship. In this way, Robespierre saw himself as synonymous with the Supreme Being and a representative of the revolution, seeking to mold his own idea of a revolutionary citizenry. But Robespierre only attempted to control the French people in his feat of providing a new moral authority. According to Azouf, he was too dependent on unanimity and exerting his power over men's souls. Robespierre assumed he could appeal to the population with his own convictions, but his goals did not come from the deliberations of a committee of academic philosophers, according to historian Jonathan Smith. It came from his own idea that such a system was vital if the revolution were to continue toward its goal. Robespierre either did not consider or ignored the fact that the rest of the French population, including his colleagues, may have had other ideas about the cult of the Supreme Being and the revolution as a whole. Though the cult of the Supreme Being began with Enlightenment ideas, Robespierre's goal to de-Christianize French society and culture and create a new civil religion based on his own meaning of the revolution resulted in a failed attempt to control a revolutionary population. The cult of the Supreme Being arguably had good intentions, but Robespierre's attempt at control led to its demise. Indeed, Robespierre's dictatorial attitude had him eventually sent to the guillotine, and any unity experienced by the people via his Festival of the Supreme Being lasted only during that day in June of 1794.
Thank you, Hannah. We're going to close out our panel with Colton Bennett, who's going to be presenting on poverty under four Latin American leaders and assessment.
There are many ways in which societies can be judged. Treatment of the poor has been something that I find personally important when reflecting on societies and governments. Not only from a historical standpoint, but it also carries weight in our current era as well. Though living in different times and places, Juan Manuel de Rosas, Porfirio Diaz, Fidel Castro, and Augusto Pinochet were all given massive amounts of power within the Latin American sphere. Now, how that power was used to benefit or harm the poor citizens of their country was what I focused on in my research. Now, the difficulty was establishing what standard of poverty could be held for all these societies, because as time went on, things changed, and there was differences in their societies. So firstly, I was focusing on the lower rings of society. And I put an emphasis on economics, since that is the best way to see poverty is from a financial standpoint. And lastly, I also took into account domestic policy, especially actions that went over healthcare, education, and living situations. During Rosas's time, power was found in those who own land, typically with a ranch or farm on it. These were called estancieros. They retained much of the power and wealth within Argentinian society. Rosas was a conservative, and he favored distinct lines and a hierarchical system that was found under a colonial system. A middle class had not really been formed. Societal structures that existed were patron and peon, which in other words were people who owned land and then those who worked it. There were opportunities to make money to those who did not own land. However, it usually came at a cost, that being the individual's freedom. Rosas himself had many people working on his estancia, which, as I said before, was basically like a cattle ranch, comprising even of some natives and outlaws. Slaves were obviously not given money for their labor, but it is important to note that Rosas did not diminish the institution of slavery during his leadership, and in fact, the slavery that did occur was ramped up with the October 15th, 1831 decree. There were small groups that did not belong to either patron and peon groups, but those were centered in urban places like Buenos Aires. Those consisted of merchants, artisans, police, and service sector employees, which did not belong to the rural class. However, they did not make up a very large part of Argentine society. Industrialization did not occur greatly under Rosas, who kept the industrial sector basically at work with his military needs. The industrialization that did take place did provide some work, but usually that only consisted of some for people living in Buenos Aires or around Buenos Aires. Rosas did enact the Customs Law of 1835, which was a tariff that was supposed to protect national industry. The tariff protected farmers, if only marginally. Beyond that, it did little to help the poor within the society, and it's argued that it actually worsened the conditions for the poor since it raised the cost of living within the country. Economic hardships were a constant pressure faced by citizens, faced by the poor in Argentina, and with government crackdowns going on as well. This shows that Rosas' treatment of the poor was honestly terrible, and nothing was really done to assist the poor during his leadership. And even when there were things that were enacted, it either did not help or impacted negatively. Porfirio Diaz focused mostly on the Mexican economy, creating extensive economic transformations during his time as leadership. He focused on international markets with effort on creating better foreign relations. It can be said that the increased emphasis in industrialization did create jobs, and this growth was seen especially in the railroad system, which increased substantially under his leadership. Initially, these activities were undertaken by Mexican citizens, but as time went on, foreign investment became more extensive and little benefit was actually given to Mexican workers. This trend was not just reserved for the railroad sector, and in fact, Diaz's push for foreign investment hurt many workers in different sectors of Mexican industry. In November of 1876, Diaz ordered all property owned by the church that wasn't already taken away under previous laws to be sold. The profit from that land being sold was supposed to be given to charitable activities. This, however, was a unique event and not something that Diaz continued to do regularly. It was basically just a one-off. And it's not fair to say that Diaz did not make attempts at helping the impoverished. There was progress made under the Diaz administration that benefited society, such as the regime's preoccupation with domestic and scientific progress through the pursuit of a broad range of activities and initiatives in industry, sanitation, public hygiene, and mental health. The lack of economic growth, however, helped lead to the 1910 revolution, which ended Diaz's rule. The widespread anger towards Diaz was largely rooted in these trends regarding the well-being of the lower classes, especially among the urban factory workers, artisans, and those living in the rural areas of Mexico. When Castro came to power in Cuba, it was in deep poverty after the leadership of Batista. Castro had dreams and aspirations of creating an independent and self-sustaining country within Cuba. And one of Castro's first actions to these ends was to create the National Institute of Agrarian Reform. And this began a trend of many state interventions in industries, especially in areas where American influence was most prevalent, such as with public utilities, mining, and the sugar industry. In 1960, Castro nationalized Cuba's oil refineries, which ramped up the hostilities between U.S. and Cuba, leading to an embargo on Cuba by the United States, which made the economic situation in Cuba even more volatile. Now, Castro knew that for his goals to be attained, there was first prerequisites that had to be met, those being education, healthcare, and housing. Castro sent literacy brigades into the countryside to educate the illiterate population, helping them learn how to read and write, which was very successful. The campaign became one of the revolution's great epics because it virtually wiped out illiteracy in Cuba in a few years. Castro also created a healthcare system that was free to the public, along with an improved housing situation for the people of Cuba. This was done in part to divert attention of wages and demands from the Cubans on consumer goods. This particularly impacted the rural populations, which had not received much attention from the state, with only 15% of households having running water and only 9% having electricity. As time went on, the Cuban economy was taking on large amounts of debt to the communist bloc. Facing an economic crisis, Castro decided that a new direction towards material incentives and a drawback from communist ideals should be implemented to put the Cuban economy back on track and avoid total catastrophe. When the collapse of communism came, the Cuban economy was hit with a crisis yet again. And in order to stay afloat, the leadership in Cuba put out many initiatives, such as a food program, so that the people of Cuba would not starve after the supply and production of food had taken a hit as well. Health issues that Cuba had once seemed to eradicate began to appear in the fallout of the collapse, yet the quality of doctors in Cuba remained high despite the failing diets and goods that were available. Despite the problems and setbacks Cuba faced, the actions taken regarding health and education, along with living standards, helped not just the poor, but the Cuban citizens in general. Even if the economic benefits weren't that substantial, the benefits derived from the other policies greatly bettered the lives of the poor in Cuba at the time. Now, the starting off point for Chile had been a bit different from other countries. Previously, Chile had a socialist ruler, Allende, and the focus of that government was providing education and healthcare. Only 16.4% of the population could not read or write, and there was only a 3% unemployment rate. In response to increased unemployment and wage disparity, Pinochet implemented the minimum employment program with the goal to assist those who were suffering, providing healthcare and wages to work on infrastructure and lower skilled service jobs. The collapse of the economy was something that the lower economic classes were never able to fully recover from. The economic downturn for the poor can best be seen in 1983, when more than 100,000 people living in Santiago could no longer afford electricity. There was also a crackdown from the government on organized labor that could be tied to leftist movements. Going further, in 1975, the outright banning of strikes in certain areas that could hinder economic stability. The economy of Chile was not aimed at assisting the poor. The health care available to the poor was not as good as the private health care clinics that were favored by those who were not only healthy but could afford the better treatment. Housing took a hit as well. Chileans could no longer afford to live in their own separate houses and were often forced to move in with their relatives or take on relatives to afford the cost of living. All the leaders discussed had the opportunities to help the economically disadvantaged, yet none of them really placed an importance on that endeavor as much as Fidel Castro did. Castro, even though faced with economic troubles, helped create a Cuba that could be a model for third world countries, even being able to have comparable sectors with modern countries at the time, as seen with the healthcare system that was implemented. Castro himself was even able to hold on to power even after the collapse of international communism, without Cuba falling into total disarray. When compared to the other leaders and their actions and policies towards the poor, it is apparent that Castro not only did the most, but saw the most success in his pursuit of creating a better Cuba. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Colton. And with that, we have some time for some questions from the audience. Dr. Lipschitz has the mic, and so if you have a question, raise your hand, and she'll come around and amplify your question.
Let me amplify your questions. Is that a hand? Okay, I will get there. Excellent.
Thank you. Okay, so like since 325 CE, the First Council of Nicaea, when the Catholic Church under Constantine sort of gelled into the juggernaut that we know it to be today, it seems like in each of your presentations, less so the last one, but there's an undertone of that this is a story of man's society's struggle against Catholicism. I mean, basically, Robespierre and the Goths were really kind of throwing it at the Holy Roman Empire and the Vikings as well. I just wondered if you have any thoughts on that.
I'll go first. From the research that I've garnered, it's the Vikings worked with Christianity until it got to be a point where it was being it was compulsory conversion. Because of their extensive travel and trade with so many distant societies, they had gotten used to Christianity and its system, and they had incorporated a lot of that belief system into their own. So they weren't unknown to it, they weren't unaware, but I think it was more when it became, well, you have to do this now under threat, that it became, well, wait a minute. And there were some replacement, so some very key parts of their paganistic belief system were replaced, but there were also very key components that were not. And I mean, their whole way of dealing with issues as far as blood revenge, it's a norm for them. It was no longer an option because it was an offense. So they didn't have a replacement for that. They were like, no. So.
Yeah, oh, sorry, go ahead. Okay, I'll speak. Yeah, you're exactly right. The larger context of the French Revolution is, you know, the Third Estate was kind of just like lashing out against the nobility, and the First Estate, the church, So in that sense, I mean, it was about Christianity and that Enlightenment thought, but it was also about, you know, they wanted the church's land, and they wanted the church had so much money, and they just, I mean, they didn't, so they wanted, you know, that. If that makes sense. Go ahead.
In the case of like the Goths and that whole with the Romans, one of the things is that religion was much less of a motivator for that conflict than other factors at the time. And that's especially can be seen after the Visigoths established their kingdom in Spain. It became a very heavily Christian kingdom. And they used that to relate to the fact that a minority of Goths were ruling over a majority of Roman citizens in the area. So I don't think you can see the struggle against Catholicism or Christianity in my portion as much.
In my paper, I really didn't talk about religion too much. The only thing that I could kind of tie to that was under the Diaz administration when that land from the church was being taken away. That really wasn't being antagonistic to religion in general. It was just so much that the Catholic Church had been a juggernaut in the area for the longest time, and they owned a huge amount of land. So it was more about giving that back to the country.
My question is for all of you. As when we research and when we do things, obviously there are points that help you solidify your thesis, and there are points that happen to alter your thesis. Were there any of those that were in your researching as you're doing it that just kind of just went, yes, this is it, or went, oh no, let me go another route?
I like how you guys all stare at me like the second the question's asked. I don't remember a whole lot specifically from like when I was crafting my thesis and working on the paper and stuff. I do remember that I went back and heavily edited it based on what points I was covering. But I found a lot of information as I was reading through, like that quote I left in from the historian, Barbaro. I read that as I was going through. I'm like, that's in the paper. I'm highlighting it right here. I'm going to use that because it was just, there was so much information. I also got to draw a lot from primary source documents because a lot of the Roman historians at the time who were contemporaries of the event documented the events very well. And it really made the research a lot easier since I was drawing from accounts of what happened rather than people writing about it centuries after the fact.
Kind of the part that I liked the best was the progressiveness of Viking women. I mean, it was still a very domestic patriarch society, but it was, they allowed them more freedom. So when I found the study about the genomic research, the grave site had actually been from the 1880s. And it wasn't until 2014 that they were able to genetically test and determine that that was was a woman. And that was just like, ah, yes. So that was mine.
For me, like I sort of knew the background of the cult of the Supreme Being being part of this larger issue of de-Christianization, but I'd say the turning point for me was, you know, doing my research and reading that it was Robespierre, like all the way, like he just totally took it over and made it about himself.
I like to focus on poverty and things like that in a lot of my papers. For this one, it was a bit challenging though, because the sources that I used 4 books, and of those 4 books, there was only like 3 pages that actually, on one single book that actually mentioned poverty. The rest I had to kind of go through and just scour the books and see what I could tie to poverty. So I guess the kind of moment was like, oh man, this is not going to be easy, because obviously they didn't care too much about poverty. So.
My question is directed more at Randy than anyone else. But you mentioned that the Goths were essentially put within the Roman Empire and were promised to be taken care of by the Roman. Was there any comparison, or did you ever think about comparing that to the way the Native Americans in here were treated as they were put on reservations, but then also didn't get what they wanted and which caused several revolts, I was wondering if there was a comparison there. Plus, I had then one other question. You mentioned how Valens didn't wait for support and went ahead and attacked or initiated the fight. Now that also, being an American history teacher, that sounded very much like Custer at the Little Bighorn. And I was wondering, was Valens just that confident, or was he seeking glory and more attention or more support from the other Romans?
To answer your questions, yes.
Yeah, okay.
I think a very direct comparison can be drawn between the way the Goths were originally tried or potentially incorporated into the empire with the way that Native Americans were treated. Essentially, the purest of intentions gone awry by bureaucracy and corruption. There's a very direct comparison there. And then again with General Custer, that almost identical situations of people who didn't read their history textbooks. As far as Valens, it was very much a push for personal glory. One of the things with the Roman military being such a powerhouse politically is that victory on the battlefield basically cemented yourself as a ruler, as a very strong ruler. And that would have given him immense amounts of political power outside of what he already had. And like I said, he was potentially waiting to be supported by his own nephew. And there can be a lot of family conflict or drama when it comes to Roman history. And he definitely wanted to keep the glory to himself rather than sharing it with his nephew.
Oh, thank you very much for the presentation. It was a great panel, and all the papers were so different. It made me realize how so often in history you have, over the years, different historians approaching their subject differently with different perspectives. For instance, if you go back a few hundred years, you can have Hegel, that saw history as the unfolding of God's mind. Marx saw history as the unfolding of this economic dialectic. Frederick Jackson Turner saw history as in America, this struggle against the frontier. And even in the 20th century, Sigmund Freud saw history as this kind of intergenerational fighting, as one generation seeks to basically destroy what came before to make something new. And my question to you is this: in your research, did you come to any idea as to what drove history, at least the little bit of history that you were studying? Is there something out there? Is it like big migrations of people? Is it individuals like Robespierre who said, I'm going to make a difference? Or is it something else? Were you able to come to any insight as to what was the nature of history? It's a small question. Very small question to have at the end of a conference.
Yeah, save it for the last panel. While this is not an adequate answer to your very large question, as far as the migrations and maybe the propelling of the raids for the Vikings in general, I did kind of read some competing theories as far as it was, to say that it was an activity rather than an ethnic or a race or anything like that. That's been agreed upon, but the reason why behind it, I've read that there was just a lack of land. There was a lack of, and I'm taking your question in a totally different direction than what you intended, but a lack of land, or the men had to kind of prove their masculinity because of the limited women, the ratios of male to females, and just population and procreation, but not really a definitive answer one way or the other of why they left, why they migrated. Was it because they could, because they had the innovative technology and hey, why not? Hey, this island's getting this peninsula's getting a little small, we should probably go. Were they the outlaws that, okay, we're gonna kick you out now because you didn't behave? A lot of different theories that I read through, but.
Population pressures.
Yes, that's kind of what it boiled down to, a lot of population pressures.
The history that I know and love is the history of movements of people and innovations of people, and I think sometimes throughout history there's certain people or figures or administrations that move things along or make decisions that change things for better or for worse, but in a great way. I think that's kind of what's happening here.
The people that I focused on in this paper were dictators, and they controlled a lot of power within their societies. They either got that power from revolution or were ousted because of revolution. And I guess to kind of take a stab at your question, it's like conflict between societies and their rulers. When enough is enough. I don't know where I'm really going with this so much. It's just I guess the conflict of people against their leaders, things not being done, things being done such as terror being brought on their citizens as a driving force for change.
Crisis theory and the theory of a critical mass creating something else.
Yeah, I think it's really hard, especially with my little chunk that I presented on, to find one overarching theme of why this happened. But I think it's really interesting to look at the different motivations behind the different actions that people took. So like Valens and the Romans, they saw themselves as putting down inferior peoples. They weren't motivated by survival, they were motivated by wealth or political power. But the Goths were in a position where they were faced with the choice of die to the Huns or maybe not die to the Romans. So they were in a position where they took actions out of much more desperate emotions. And seeing the different motivations there is interesting.
Thank you.
I actually think that's a good question to wrap up on because it brings lots of things together in a very interesting way. Let's give this panel a round of applause.